time to study for the bone exam. So for your bone exam, you'll have 25 questions, and each of those questions will have 4 questions underneath. So you'll have 25 bones with 4 questions specifically for that bone. So for example, you will have a card similar to this one where you'll have the bone number, and your bones will be labeled with which number. And then there's an A, B, C, and D under each number. Each of your A, B, C, and D will have a question for that specific bone. And so each part of that question may be labeled on the bone. So for example, you have a bone, and so you'll have the A on there, and you'll write on your answer sheet what bone that is, so the whole bone. Then, for example, some of them will have left or right, so they won't be labeled as B on that bone, but your answer for B needs to be whether or not that's a left or right bone. Next, sometimes you'll have, and actually for a lot of your bones, you'll have a specific feature. So whatever feature that for example, in this case, the C is on, you will write down on your answer sheet what that feature is. And lastly, some of the questions will have something very specific, like what's special about this bone, or what ganglion lives in this bone. And so those questions are also on your study guide. So speaking of the study guide, your study guide is located under Laboratory on the menu on the left under Blackboard. So when you click Laboratory, you'll see a link for the bone exam study guide, and that's what will be on the screen. So starting from the top, of course, it lists all your bones. Highlighted in yellow is the reference numbers for the textbook. So if you want to look at the cartoon version of that bone, then you can do so in the textbook. Of course, you can still do this also in your lab book, or if you have like an app you want to look at, or there's ways to look at it through Connect, or the flashcards as well. You can do it that way as well, but the figure numbers are referenced to the textbook and not your lab book. So one way to study your bones is to look at the bones in just their major categories. So instead of focusing on features or things that are special about that bone, specifically, first starting with getting down your axial and appendicular skeleton. That way you have at least your general broad overview of your bones. So I'm going to grab my little skeleton off to the side here. Oops. So starting with the axial skeleton, so that's your bones that are in the middle portion of your skeleton, so not including your arms and leg regions. So for our axial skeleton, you have your cranium, which is the skull. Then you have the sternum, which is your breastbone. The vertebrae, which is the spine. So let's flip him around to the back, see that better. So all the way down from the base of the skull, all the way down to your lower back region. The ribs, which are attached to or make a joint, also called an articulation with the vertebrae, and moving around the body to protect your chest cavity, and then again making another joint or articulation with your sternum in the center part of your chest. So next one, sternum, so also called your breastbone here in the center. Your sacrum and your coccyx are at the end of your vertebrae. So down here, there is a triangular shaped bone. There's a bunch of holes in it. I actually show a better, more detailed bone later. But there's that bone, which is your sacrum. And then at the very tip is your coccyx. So moving on to our appendicular skeleton, so your arms and legs. So attaching your arm to your body, you have your scapula, which is here in the back. So your shoulder blade bone. Next one, your clavicle, which is in the front. That's also your collarbone. The humerus, so that's your first arm bone. So that's this one, major big one up here, kind of the more superior part of your arm. The radius is below, so you have 2 bones in your forearm, your radius and your ulna. So the way to remember which one is which, your radius is on your thumb side. So thinking of something as being rad or like thumbs up, or you like something, is on your thumb side. So thinking thumb, rad, radius. So here in our little skeleton dude, here's our thumb. So on this one, not so detailed, but good enough, is our radius. And the other one on this side, on the pinky side, is the ulna. And that is spelled incorrectly. Let's change that. So continuing on with your arm region, moving into your hand, you have your next set of bones, which are your carpals. So those are little small bones that make up your wrist and back part of your hand. Moving on to the metacarpals, which are in between your carpals here and the tips of your fingers, so that first set of bones there. Next set are your phalanges, so past your metacarpals. Now just dealing with these far 3 or 2 bones at the end of your hands to make up your finger areas. Moving to our leg region, so we have our os coxa, so that's the generic name for the entire hip bone. So there's actually 3 bones that fuse together to create your hip bone. So the fused bone is called the os coxa. Then your big large bone here at your upper leg region, that's your femur. In front of that is your patella, also called your kneecap. It's a little fused in the skeleton, but that's okay. Then you have your tibia and your fibula in your lower leg region. So one way to remember that, which one's which. So you have your tibia, which is your bigger one. Then you have your fibula is on the outer side. So it being like the smaller bone, like little kids tell fibs. Kind of one way to remember which one, the bigger one or the small one, is the fibula. Dropping the hands. Okay, so now down to our foot region. We have our tarsals, which are our ankle bones and back of the foot bones. In that region, show the front of that. So there as well. Then moving on, so tarsal toes, we have our metatarsal, so that first row of bones, right distal to your metacarpals. And then also having phalanges in your toes, so those far distal bones in your foot or toe region. Okay, so next I'm going to move on to the cranium, so focusing just on the bones in the skull. There are a lot of bones in your cranium, and for the exam, you're only going to focus on the ones that are on the more external surface of the bones, as well as bones that I tell you to know. For example, some of your smaller bones, you actually have to just know them. For example, which bones make up the orbit of the eye? So that's actually going to be a question on your exam. So you're just going to have to listen. You're not going to have to be able to label them, partially because your eye orbit bones, which are a bunch of little tiny little bones that make up your eye socket, they're very small and kind of hard to be able to point out specifically. So starting at the top here, knowing the sutures. There we go. So on your top of your skull, when you have a baby and when they're coming out of the birth canal, let's do it with my little cheap one here. The skull isn't whole, so in order to help squish the baby's head so it can get through the birth canal, all these bones aren't one big solid structure. They're actually filled with cartilage in between them, and then allows for those bones to be pushed out the way. So for your sutures, and again, like I mentioned from some earlier YouTube, little cheap little decorations for Halloween are actually fairly decent at getting some of your details. So we use, look, it's so much easier to see. So knowing the sutures, there's 4 sutures you need to know. So the first one is your coronal suture, so going across the top of the head, just like a coronal cut through the body, so like, or frontal cut through the body, cutting off the front of that person. Coronal cut is still in that same plane. Next one is sagittal. So same thing like your sagittal plane, dividing left and right. Sagittal plane, sagittal suture going down the middle of your skull. Next suture is your squamous suture. So that's this one over here, off to the side, going around your temporal bone. And then the last suture to know is the lambdoidal. So in this little picture, you can't really see it. Well, this skull, you can't really see it that well, why it's called lambda. But there's a Greek letter called lambda, and its shape is similar to that suture. So let me go my better featured bone. So here, this suture kind of looks more pointed like a triangle. That triangle gets its name after its shape, so looking very similar to this capital letter lambda or even the lowercase lambda. So next one, know which bones make up the ordered eye. Just memorize that list. Some of them you'll be able to know as you're studying your different bones and at least can remember some of them instead of trying to memorize the list. Being able to put at least some of them down, knowing, okay, I remember this bone is at this location and that location also is part of the eye. So that's one of the bones I need to put down. One thing I forgot for the sutures. So there's a special type of bone that as those bones are fusing together and forming their sutures, sometimes you have an island of bone inside that suture. So this skull is actually giving you an example of it. So that can be actually a whole lot larger too as well. So we have some of those examples of those types of skull in the lab. So these wormian bones are island bones that are inside of the suture. So if you're thinking kind of like if the suture were a river, and then there's the river gets split by the island. So we have 3 places here, and then going back into the suture. So kind of a little bit of bone that is in the middle of where that suture is. Bubbles. Okay. So orbit of the eye. Okay, so now we're going to move into all of the different bones that make up your skull. So the ones you actually need to know, need to be able to identify. So your first bone is your frontal bone. So that's the one that's on your forehead. So again, cheap Halloween decoration still works. So go to my little fancier one because it has the detail that I want. So that's this big bone here. There's also a disarticulated skull inside of the lab, which is also color-coded. So this also being the frontal bone in that set. So you can actually, it's kind of difficult to do so, but I've actually had someone who was determined to put all the pieces together to form the skull because they don't exactly fit correctly. You know, kind of slightly off plastic. Okay, so frontal bone, that's the bone you need to know. There is one feature you do need to know for the frontal bone, and that's the supraorbital foramen or notch. So thinking supra or above, orbital as in the eye orbit, and it's a foramen or a small hole or notch. So these small holes that are above the eye sockets are your supraorbital foramens. Next bone, tilting, we have our parietal bones. So these big gigantic bones on the sides of the head, a left one and a right one. In between them runs your sagittal suture. So there's a bony joint, so a joint made up of bone that runs in between those 2 bones. So with our color coding, so 2 bones, both of them making up part of your skull. So sagittal suture in between them, locking them together. So this would be from the back side. This would be from the front side. So we have the frontal bone, which would be in front of that. So if I was trying to put this together, this would go right here. Of course, it doesn't really fitting so well, but okay. So frontal bone, and then here's our parietal in green. Okay, so for that one, you just have to know that bone, being able to label it, as well as knowing the sagittal suture runs in between them. Next bone is the temporal bone. So it's the bone that runs on the side of the skull, getting its name from the gray hair. That's kind of the first area of gray hair that shows up on a person. So thinking like time or old timer, like a temporal. It's kind of another way for saying time. So that's this bone right here on the side. So extends also out, going towards your cheek area. So again, we also have that bone separated out in the lab. And again, cheap little Halloween decoration, does well. So here's a separated temporal bone. And for your temporal bone, so placing them side by side. Of course, this is the, yeah, this is the right side. So placing them side by side, you can see them. Put that one down. For your temporal bone, you have to know particular features. So labeled as D on this one is the external acoustic meatus. So it's a large hole or dent where the ear is. So your ear canal actually goes down into that little hole. So that's this feature right here. So right, the little hole there. Some of the holes on the plastic pieces aren't actually supposed to be holes, like for that example, that one. That's not a real hole, that's just plastic molding issues. But real hole that we're looking for is right here. Next one, the styloid process, so the spine here. Let's see, the next one, the zygomatic process, which is the long bar here. And finally, the mastoid process, which is this kind of more bulgy piece off the end of this bone there. Okay. Next bone for our cranium or skull is the occipital bone. So occipital bone is at the back of the skull. So it's this big bone here. So we have our lambda suture running across it. Halloween decoration. Works just fine. So for the occipital bone, the features you have to know, really obvious feature one is this big gigantic hole called the foramen magnum. And so you'll actually have a question asking you what bone is the foramen, what bone is, in what bone is the foramen magnum? And so your answer would be occipital. So that big large hole allows for your spinal cord as well as other blood vessels to run out of your skull. Actually, just your spinal cord. There's other holes for blood vessels and stuff to run in and out. So hole for the spinal cord allows it to exit since your spinal cord is fairly large, and so it needs a fairly large hole. The other feature that you need to know for the occipital bone are your occipital condyles. So if you remember from our vocabulary, the condyles are where you have a joint feature on a bone. So kind of the surface here is where it will form a joint with the first vertebrae, which has its own special name called the atlas. So going back to your Greek mythology, I think, or Roman, I don't remember. There was a character who had to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders, very literally. So thinking this larger portion of the skull being your globe, that first one being Atlas, holding up your skull. So our occipital condyles are just surface where it makes that joint with that first vertebrae. So to show you the occipital bone just by itself, so here's our lambdoid suture, foramen magnum, occipital condyles. So just separate it by itself. Next bone, sphenoid bone. So your sphenoid bone is a little bit more of an internal bone. It's behind the eye and before your temporal bone. So part of it actually shows on the outside surface. So locate it here, and then it also moves inside the eye. This isn't a good example, so I'm going to move this to this one. So outside here, moving towards the inside of your eye. For this one, part of the features you're going to have to know are actually on the inside of the skull. So you get to open the skull cap off and look on the inside. So still featuring on sphenoid bone going to the back of the eye. So here, back of the eye, and also inside of the base of the skull. That bone is also separate in the lab. The separate sphenoid bone that is in our little puzzle of skull that's in the lab is colored red. So here is the back of the eye portion. Here's that side portion that you can see on the side of the bone. And looking at our internal features, so here's the same eye features there, and then I'm going to turn it. Able to see the same features on the inside of the skull, so knowing where those features are located inside the skull. So for your sphenoid bone, one thing you do have to know for it, so kind of like my little example card of like a little number 14. Of course, that's different from the actual number 14, but that doesn't matter. Okay, so for that card, one of the questions that kind of has a special one for the sphenoid bone is what gland lives in that, and that's your pituitary gland. Features to know for your sphenoid bone, so you have your greater wings, which are the larger ones on top. Sorry, larger wings on the bottom. So if I'm looking at the back of it, so here's our frontal view, so side. This is the back part of the eye socket, so one of your eye socket bones, hint, hint. So we have the larger wings on the bottom. It's actually easier to see this if I flipped it around for your wings. So larger ones at the bottom are your greater wings. The lesser wings are the smaller ones on top. The superior orbital fissure. So for your exam, to note that I'm talking about a hole, I will run a pipe cleaner through that hole and then just have it twisted with it labeled whatever letter that it needs to be. So number and letter. So it'll run through particular holes. Well, there we go. And then you'll be able to specifically know which hole I'm talking about. Oh well. Okay, so for the holes for the sphenoid bone, looking at the superior orbital fissure. So thinking superior being above, so it's the, there we go. Smaller one here, up at the top. Then you have your inferior orbital fissure, the one at the bottom. The next one is the optic canal, or also called the optic foramen. So it's a hole in the back. So here you have your superior orbital fissure. So fissure, thinking more like a gash. And your optic canal is a hole, so close to it. Sorry. So there's our little hole. And it's able to run through and see to the other side right here on your sphenoid bone. So able to see that hole where it comes out from the top of the skull. So like a kind of a superior view into your skull. The last part of the sphenoid bone that you have to know is the Scylla Turcica, or Turcica. It's the area in between the wings. So here's our wings, there and there. And it's this area right here that you have to know where that is on the sphenoid bone. Okay, so our last view, we have the ethmoid bone, which is a more internal bone, but for your knowledge to know for it is knowing the features that you actually can see. So only this little central part of your skull is actually part of the ethmoid bone that you actually will be able to see, particularly for the test. So the features you have to know is the cristae galli. So that's this little fin that's right here. Let me zoom this in. And focus. All right. So this little fin here is your cristae galli, and then the little dots on the side of it is called your cribriform plate, and that allows your nerves that are coming from your nasal cavity to be able to run up and towards your brain. So just little spaces for that. Again, looks better on our real human skulls that we have in the lab. Okay, so ethmoid bone, knowing that the cristae galli is on the ethmoid bone, and that the cribriform plate are the little dotted holes that are around the cristae galli, which looks like a dorsal fin. Next bone for the skull is the mandible. So that's your jawbone. So attaches to the skull. Oh yeah. Like this. So a lot of your skulls will have this kind of spring in there to attach your jawbone. The one I picked up just happened to not be so. So here we have our jawbone, how it's connected to the skull. So I'm going to pull that one out separately. Okay, so for our mandible, separated out from the rest part of the skull. So one of the questions for the mandible is that I asked if it's technically a fused bone in an adult. So during development, it's not fused, but as a person becomes an adult, a bony joint forms in between, fusing the two sides of the mandible together into a feature for the mandible called the Mandibular Symphysis. So that's this kind of bony connection right here. Other features to note on the mandible are the mandibular condyle. So this is where it makes that joint with the temporal bone. And the other one is the coronoid process. Pause. Yep, I was right. Okay, so coronoid process being right here. Just doubted for myself for a second. Okay, so that's the last thing for your mandible. Next one is the maxilla. So the maxilla makes up the upper part of your mouth region. So part of your nose a little bit. And then extending towards the back of the throat. So making part of your more anterior part of the roof of your mouth, which allows us to be able to breathe as well as eat food at the same time. So for the maxilla, we just have to know where it is, and should also have to know, because it's not on here, the processes going from the, no, it's zygomatic that you have to know. Never mind. Okay, so just maxilla. All right. Palantine bone, back side of the roof of the mouth. So that's this kind of orangey red color back here. So the back part or more posterior part of the roof of the mouth. Oh, oops, still going. Okay, other bones, you have the palatine and lacrimal. Those are your eye socket bones. You don't actually have to be able to identify on the skull. Zygomatics on the cheekbone, so that's this portion here. So kind of where you can make all these little cool kind of holes there, kind of sticks there. So that's this process here. So there's a temporal process that sticks out towards your temporal bone. Zygomatic process goes toward your zygomatic bone. It also has a maxilla process going towards the maxilla bone. And your maxilla, that's what I was mentioning. Maxilla bone also has a zygomatic process going towards the zygomatic bone. A nasal bone on the bridge of the nose region here. Vomer, bottom part of the nasal septum bone. Inferior nasal concha, so lower part of your nasal chamber. Helps with your breathing. Then the last bone for your skull. So this bone actually isn't a part of the skull, but very closely associated to it. And this is your hyoid bone. So this bone is actually, and this is what's so special about this bone. So that question for that card. What's so special about it is it doesn't form a joint with any other bone. So it's actually suspended by muscle and cartilage. And in our little description, looks like vampire teeth. So if I flip this thing upside down, kind of looks like those cheap little vampire teeth that you give kids at Halloween instead of giving them candy. So flip it upside down, kind of looks like vampire teeth. But this is actually how it is in your throat. So below your skull, suspended below there, part of helping to form the shape of your trachea and give it support. So next video, continuing with the axial skeleton, starting with the vertebrae.